All right, we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents, and welcome back to your weekly COVID-19 update. Got the full crew here this week, joined by SO, Filthy Heretic, and Night Shift 10,000, and we're here to discuss everything that's been going on with regards to COVID-19, government shutdowns, and all the other craziness. So, as always, let's start off by taking a look at where the U.S. national debt is and where the Federal Reserve's balance sheet is. I know last week the debt had topped 25 trillion, and that was a really big deal. Taking a look at usdebtclock.org right now, the national debt is 25,475,607,000,000 and climbing fast. So up about another 500 billion this week. Probably going to top 26 trillion by next week, and probably going to keep going faster than that. As for the Fed's balance sheet, that has officially surpassed 7 trillion this week. In particular, an increased buying of corporate bonds. So the money printers go burr is very much still a thing, and it seems that this is how the government believes it is going to resolve this crisis. Now,
remember how that meme was initially conceived of to make fun of Austrian critics of central banking monetary policy? Boy, did that age poorly.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Was that really the case? I mean, I didn't know that.
First time I saw the money printer go burr meme, that's what it was. It was meant to it was like an ANCAP zoomer. It was a zoomer with like an ANCAP colored bow tie, crying and saying, "No, you can't just print money to end the monetary crisis," or I don't remember exactly word for word what it said off the top of my head, but yeah, it was originally, at least in that form, the money printer go burr form. It was intended to be derogatory towards Austrians.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that's interesting about that is thinking back to the 2008-2009 financial crisis. I remember quantitative easing being sold as, this is an emergency temporary measure. This is something that we are only doing in light of the current recession. It's an emergency. When this is all over, we will absolutely put a stop to it. Interest rates will normalize. And it's don't look forward to this being a common policy that the Fed or other central banks around the world will employ. Well, of course, since 2008, 2009, interest rates did not normalize. If you can look up the base money supply, and ever since quantitative easing started, it's not gone back down. Interest rates kept getting cut lower and lower. Earlier, and we've talked about this, I probably sound like a broken record at this point because I know I've brought it up quite a few times, but early on in President Trump's tenure, he was talking about how great the economy is doing, but the Fed needs to stop raising interest rates so much. We need to cut them even further. And I pointed out at the time that makes absolutely no sense. If the economy is doing great, you should not have to cut interest rates. They told us this was a temporary measure, something that it's not going to happen. That was only an extreme measure that we'll go to in these dire economic times, but then, we'll never have to resort to it again. Well, I shouldn't say never, but not that the idea that it was only going to be temporary, because even if they slowed down cutting interest rates, they never stopped the printing of money. And now, in light of COVID-19, they're just, money printers go burr. It's ridiculous. As I just said there, the Fed's balance sheet is now over 7 trillion, and the national debt's climbing faster than it ever has. All the while we were assured, this is a temporary emergency measure. Now, states around the United States, quite a few of the states are now entering phase one and some phase two of reopening their economies. Yet it remains the case that more and more Americans, millions of Americans, continue to be filing for unemployment. So this very quick economic recovery that President Trump and others have been looking forward to, I don't have high hopes for. Pumpkin Roth, thank you for that super chat. I missed SO. Maximum romance has been achieved. Thank you, Pumpkin.
Yeah. There is something about the... sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say, yeah, I'm sorry I've been gone for like the last 2 to 3 streams. I've been like waking up at 8 p.m., going to bed around 9 to 10. So I mean, like literally, I've been like that's the reason why I haven't been here.
Wow, that sounds like my sleep schedule.
I mean, pretty much. I guess I
Now-
don't know what yours is.
Now, I did want to say something about the what's it called? I wanted to say something about the lockdowns being lifted. I don't know if there's an official term for it, but I am strongly convinced that it's part of an agenda.
Oh yeah.
Now, I remember
absolutely.
reading.
Yep.
I remember reading an article on Zero Hedge that pointed out that in pandemics throughout history, from the Hong Kong flu to the SARS epidemic to the Spanish flu, and there's even evidence of this occurring in during the Black Plague, that there's 3 outbreaks that occur during an outbreak. You have the initial one, the second one, which is always worse than the first one, and the third one, which is weaker than the other 2. And so what I think is going to be happening is that the lockdowns being lifted is entirely social engineering, that they're going to release a lot of their restrictions on the economy, which, by the way, if you recall, is being completely half-assed, where
Yeah.
businesses are being allowed to open, but they're only being allowed to open under incredibly limited and restricted circumstances, like restaurants only being limited to 25% capacity, for example.
And having to keep their tables 6 feet apart, which means a lot of them actually have to move tables out of the restaurant just to comply.
Yep.
Yeah. And what's gonna end up happening is that I have absolute certainty that there are a lot of people advising the government, in the government, whispering in the ears of the policy makers, who are fully aware that there's going to be a second jump. And what's going to happen is, when there is this second bump, and it's going to turn out to be worse than the initial, probably, then what's going to happen is the media is going to restart the pandemic about how everyone's going to die, and the people are going to go all over the media, all over social media, and politicians are going to be screaming from the rooftops that releasing the lockdowns is a terrible idea, and we need to do more in terms of surveillance, do more in terms of locking down. We need to do what China did when they controlled their outbreak. They didn't. Like welding people into their houses.
Like just not reporting people who've been diagnosed and killing them and quietly burning their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I also wanted to mention something, and this is also a pretty interesting fact. There were states during this whole thing that had absolutely no lockdowns. They did not go into any, they didn't control businesses. They didn't close any businesses, and they did not have any lockdowns to speak of. And they had some of the lowest infection ratings and viral contagion ratings of all the states. So,
Also,
yeah.
I thought you were done.
No. Go ahead. I am done. I'm done with
Oh.
that. I thought that was an interesting fact to bring up.
Okay, well, there are also entire countries on that note of comparing jurisdictions to other jurisdictions that have behaved differently. There are entire countries that have done nothing, and they're still experiencing recession in their economy right now. But just what I was going to add on to what Filthy was saying. Yeah, I 100% agree with that, because we've seen governments of the past, particularly of the Spanish flu pandemic, use that as a sort of tool of social engineering to also explain why the economy went into recession, and that's what I think the population's being prepped for as well. There's already articles. And I'm not going to delve too much into this because we're about to talk about this later on, but I'm starting to see articles of people like Paul Krugman, for instance, suggesting that if the bans on legal commerce are lifted, that there actually will be a depression. Now, like wrap your head around that reasoning. Like I wouldn't advise it, but that's actually what state media is trying to tell people now. But
Yeah, that
if
people not working, not producing goods and services is what is going to cause a depression.
Oh yeah.
Yep, that sounds completely legit to me. I mean, doesn't that just
Okay.
make absolute sense?
Okay, I got to make sure we get to this. Lance Clemmings,
All
thank
right.
you for your super chat. He says, so I got my Trump bucks just slipped into my account without my consent, let alone my initial awareness. So recommendations for a first-time handgun. I guess, are you asking, I'm not sure if you're asking, you want a specific brand and model or just generic. I mean, if it's a first-time handgun, I might recommend a 38 or a 40 caliber, 9mm, all pretty easy to learn to shoot with, but I don't know. Anyone have any specific brands they'd like to throw out?
I don't know about brands, but I mean, a 22, you're not going to get much stopping power. But one, it's going to be scary for have it pointed at people, and two, it's fairly fun to shoot targets with it because the recoil is very, very small.
I will
I'd say, well, no, I would say Springfield XD. Those are really awesome.
Okay.
First handgun I ever owned was a Beretta 40. It was pretty nice.
Oh, those are good too.
But just what I was gonna add is I totally like that would, the whole narrative that the legal shutdown on commerce ending, creating a depression that would, just completely getting past the absolute nonsense reasoning behind that. Or the lack thereof, that would sort of complement the point that Filthy is establishing, because I'd be willing to bet, I just went to the store not too long ago, and I'm starting to see the price of meat get ridiculous. Like a pound of bacon at my local store costs $12 now. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if that is also what the state has in mind. They're getting ready to lift the legal restrictions because, like, the real depression is about to start.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to the point where it is unquestionable. The stock prices can continue to go up, but we are going to be living in a state of abject poverty. By we, I mean the people who are continuing to try and operate in the legal market.
And I guess that's probably a good transition to get into one of the first topics I'd like to discuss here. So Esso already brought him up, but I have an article pulled up here from the New York Times opinion column written by Paul Krugman. For those of you who may not know, Paul Krugman is a Keynesian economist, very popular among left-wing figures and very popular among the New York Times. He's regularly published there. In 2008, he received a Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. And Krugman, he is, not afraid to tell you how right he's been about everything he's ever written. And in particular, in this, Esso did mention that this week he said that opening the economy is actually going to lead to a depression, which, as ridiculous as that sounds. But I was drawn to this particular article. It was published April 24th, 2019. It's called Survival of the Wrongest. And in it, Krugman really rips into anyone who's on the right-wing crazies, as he calls them, anyone who is of the Austrian economic persuasion. He says, and basically Krugman says this, in 2008 and 2009, when the Fed launched QE in order to combat the recession that was caused by the bursting of the housing bubble, there were a great deal of Austrian economists. He names a few people here, among them Ron Paul and others, who basically said that this was a foolish move that the Fed was making that would ultimately lead to a hyperinflation, and that he cites also a 2010 open letter to Ben Bernanke, who was then chairman of the Fed, arguing the same thing, that quantitative easing was a fool's errand, that it could only ultimately end in hyperinflation. He says, well, in 2009 through 2014, we never saw hyperinflation. And he posts in this article, he posts some charts that show the rate of consumer price inflation compared to the rate of the increase in the money supply. And yes, there is consumer price inflation, but definitely not anything hyperinflation worthy. And he said this was, a definitive test, and it essentially proved that these traditional Austrian economists were absolutely wrong, and they're wrong now because there still hasn't been hyperinflation. When are you Austrian economists going to admit that you were wrong? And quantitative easing does not necessarily lead to hyperinflation. And also I should mention that earlier today he tweeted out, and I did retweeted this with my own comment added, but Paul Krugman tweeted out today. Here, give me a second just to get it pulled up. He said, "Repeat after me. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. It doesn't make the nation as a whole poorer."
Oh, wow.
So the Keynesian economists would like us to know that essentially because hyperinflation did not occur in 2009, because it has still not yet occurred, this is proof positive the government can print as much money as it wants, spend as much as it wants, rack up as much debt as it wants, and it will never be a problem.
I mean, keep in mind that inflation has occurred, not just in the sense that it's like increased by 1% or 2% every year, but the definition of inflation is not the increase in prices. It's the increase of the monetary supply. So by definition, inflation can't not occur when you're printing money and not destroying an equivalent amount of it. So what he's saying is just absolutely, completely false, just on its face.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah,
and I think it's worth noting that what he's looking at there are consumer prices, which they went up. Make no mistake, consumer prices went up. It's just they didn't go up to the point that it can be classified as hyperinflation. However, the money that was created in QE, QE2, QE3 really went into the financial markets, and you can see that in the asset price inflation that occurred. And right now, if you take a look at the stock market, it dipped pretty hard when COVID-19 broke out, but since then, stock prices and asset prices at least have quote unquote recovered. Now I use that term lightly because we all know it; they haven't really recovered, but the prices of the assets are going up again. So it's not just because consumer prices weren't where all that new money was going. The corresponding raise in asset prices does show it's not like that money didn't have any effect on the markets, and it certainly isn't the case that you can just print money forever and it will never lead to hyperinflation. But
yeah, you should have known, anybody who didn't catch on to this already, you should have known that you were being misled when Paul Krugman focused on a specific market and didn't highlight, he specifically wanted you to focus on one type of commodity. But just what I was going to say, as for his, in response to Krugman's "debt is money that we owe to ourselves" statement, which is just absolute nonsense. Just ignoring the fact that his statement assumes that a nation state is like some sort of organization everyone is a part of, which is just obviously not true. That statement's nonsensical because it ignores something, that has been observed for the longest time, which is that inflation enters into, not inflation, but the monetary supply enters into the market differently. And because it enters into the market differently, it's necessarily going to privilege some people at the expense of others. In the case of monetary supply specifically, because this is true for any asset, it benefits the investment firms and the financial cartels at the expense of people who have savings and people who are actually like the actual investors whose who the value of their money is being depreciated. It's it's been noted before, but monetary inflation functions effectively as a redistribution of income, of not income, but savings and income towards the state's wealthy business interests and politicians.
Mm-hmm. And so I think the example that needs to be brought up again is the fact that the economy, of course, it is not money. Money is simply a medium of exchange. What really determines whether or not nation is prosperous or in poverty is the amount of goods and services that are available in total.
Exactly.
Now, and granted, depending on whether you've got a free market or a centrally planned economy or a mixed economy, that's going to affect how those goods and services are distributed. But really, what determines whether or not the economy is healthy is the total amount of goods and services. Krugman would have you believe, and as would any other Keynesian or even those that are now proponents of modern monetary theory, is that the government can just print as much money as it wants, buy it in order to fund itself, then siphon away money through taxation or whatever other means to suppress spending in order to prevent hyperinflation. Granted, they acknowledge hyperinflation could occur. They just say doing this won't in and of itself cause it, and that everything can go on without any negative effects. The government in a depression like this, the government can actually spend its way to prosperity. And it ignores the fact that creating money, printing money, does not increase the amount of goods and services available. It only allows government actors, or like Esso said, they're the privileged financial firms and those that are in cahoots with the government, to spend that new money before the inflation can take effect, effectively transferring the goods and services that already existed to two privileged actors at the expense of other people.
That's one of the various reasons why, from a technical perspective, I would say that the Austrian business cycle theory carries a greater explanatory power over others. Because the Austrian business cycle, to my knowledge, is the only one which acknowledges the fact that money enters the economy. It's not just one hegemonic unit. It enters the economy in different places and is allocated differently depending on where it enters. That's something which Mises uniquely expanded upon. It's pretty famous. Mises actually argued over that point quite a bit with his teacher von Bauer.
Absolutely, and the fact that if suppose you can imagine a hypothetical economy where you only have 10 people and if one person has a money printing machine where he can print as much money as he wants to buy anything he wants, it's going to be very evident very quickly to everyone in that 10-person economy that what he's doing is illegitimate, because no additional value is being created. He's just printing new money. It's only when you have an economy of hundreds of millions of people and a government that has created a process by which it adds so many additional steps to the process by which it creates money that the rank and file person doesn't actually recognize what's going on.
And I just wanted to add on to what 2 Cents was saying earlier. Sorry to get off track. But and a lot of people don't realize this, but GDP could be declining because of what 2 Cents mentioned earlier, and stock prices could be declining, while at the same time the average person is getting wealthier. And while everyone is getting wealthier because our knowledge of how to use our resources and the amount of resources available to us is becoming much greater.
For example, like you can see the stock market is really starting to rally since it's like 2,000, 3,000 point dips from March. And is the average person wealthier? No. what's been happening is
4.4
that
million people. 4.4 million people filed for unemployment this week. Sorry to interrupt you, Filthy, but I thought that's something to bring up.
yeah, now like the official number is up to like 39.5 or something people, or 39.5 million people are unemployed now, which is, I imagine that number is actually significantly larger because, well, to my knowledge, that largely comes from people who actually file for unemployment benefits, which counts out 40% of people who simply wouldn't even know how to begin that process,
Yeah,
or wouldn't even know that those benefits are available.
yeah, it only counts people who file for unemployment. So, everyone who hasn't filed for unemployment benefits, but has been laid off or isn't able to go to work because of state-imposed restrictions, they're not counted as someone who's unemployed. So, in reality, I'd say that the number, and just guessing of people who, the percent of people who are unemployed is probably a lot closer to like 50%, 45%. That doesn't mean people aren't working. That just means a lot more people are doing contract work or gig work. That's what most people I know are doing.
And of course, I suspect the actual number is around 55 million in the United States, which, as I'm sure you might imagine, is a very significant very significant chunk of the workforce that is way larger than the official statistics during the height of the Great Depression, which at its highest, which keep in mind how unemployment was measured at that time is different than how it is now. The highest is 40, or not 40, 24.9% unemployment rate. And just adding on to what was being said earlier, yeah, I mean, the stock market has been going up, but not only are people losing their jobs by imperial decree, mind you, but they're also, when they do keep their jobs, they're getting less hours because, businesses are not being able to get as much money, so they can't have multiple people on the same shift anymore. They've got to start cutting benefits, that sort of thing. So the average living standard for the average person is significantly declined. Meanwhile, you have GDP, which is going down despite the skyrocketing rate of government spending. And yes, keep in mind, GDP counts government spending as though that were somehow an example of wealth creation or just general commerce rather than, something that's reductive. So you're seeing the government proposing a $3 trillion stimulus bill, and that's stalled. I don't know where that's going to be going in the future, and I'm not going to be making any predictions.
We talked about that bill last week. I know it's been stalled for the time being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That said, you're going to see the fact that all of that amount of money just being thrown around very casually, the CARES Act, which is the largest stimulus bill in American history, the fact that those can go through and GDP is still going down, I think should be very indicative that, yeah, these numbers that are going to be thrown around on the mainstream media and that Trump is going to be throwing around during the campaign in an attempt to make himself look great and wonderful, those don't actually translate to people being better off. I mean, I've been seeing articles about how the rate of suicide just absolutely skyrocketed. Hell, in some locations, like the amount of people who have committed suicide as a result of these lockdowns is actually at pace, if not outpacing, the rate of COVID deaths. And you're having a whole lot of emergency centers, suicide hotlines. They're seeing like just record levels of call-ins, people asking to, why shouldn't I do it? All sorts of stuff. So yeah, there's a whole lot of just despair from this kind of stuff. Despair that could otherwise have been avoided if the lockdowns had never occurred in the first place, which, I mean, we know why the lockdowns occurred in the first place, because the government was already facing a liquidity crisis 5 months before this crisis even began, and this is a very good way to cover it up. Mass quarantine, like quarantining the entirety of the country, is a very good way to get, it's like, look, the economy sucks, but don't blame it on us, blame it on this externality.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not that means that they released COVID and infected the population deliberately, or this is just them attempting to make use of a crisis that they otherwise had no control over, I don't know. But regardless, this is where we are right now, and they're definitely using this as a cover-up to try to conceal from the American people the underlying weaknesses in the economy, as well as to create a narrative that, oh, you see, the reason that people are dying is because, well, you just have too much freedom. Oh, what's that? You don't want to be coerced? You don't want to have guns shoved in your face every freaking day? You don't want to have papers presented to government officials who are stopping you at checkpoints? Well, you just want people to die.
Oh my God, I was just about to say that. I was just about to make a reference to that song.
And I'd like to point out as well that even though there's been that sort of controlled opposition narrative in state media, where you have armed protesters with the "Don't Tread on Me" flags, begging to go back to work at their corporate wage slave jobs, being screamed at by the pink-haired people about how they just want people to die. The controlled dichotomy being that if you in order to be a proponent of individual liberty, you have to be supporting a white market industry, and you have to get a job at a white market industry, and the opposition being opposed to people leaving their homes in general. Despite that, the few states that are starting to loosen their restrictions that we were talking about earlier, what they're finding is a lot of people, they're not going back to work in white market jobs. They're continuing to do gig work, and they're continuing to use apps to find gigs that they can get paid for. And they're not using things like Uber either. There's a decentralized competitor to Uber, which a lot of the smaller restaurants are contracting to, and a lot of people are making their living through that. And you're seeing a couple articles recently about the state trying to suppress that, and restaurants trying to collaborate with the state in order to try and spread misinformation about the app, and trying to come down on the people that use those workers. Point is that it seems as though my realization, which I've been noting from the beginning, is starting in its very early stages to come to fruition, which is that people, now that they've sort of indirectly been forced to become gig workers and gray marketers, starting to realize just how shitty the white market really is. And now they're starting to base their existence and how they continue to make their living around decentralized organization.
All right, and one final thing I have to say about Krugman and his assertion. His assertion, of course, is he wants the Austrians to admit that they were wrong. Hyperinflation didn't occur in 2009. It's not occurring now. This thereby validates the Keynesian position and his position that debt is not important. Government can create as much money as it wants. It can spend as much as it wants. And so long as expert prize-winning economists like him are at the helm, it can go on forever without any negative consequences. The Austrian economists never specifically said that the hyperinflation would occur in 2009, or that it would necessarily occur within a certain number of years. What we've been saying is you cannot increase the monetary supply indefinitely. Sooner or later, supply and demand wins out. Because there are a finite amount of resources in the economy, eventually a recession those bad investments have to go bust, and a recession has to reallocate them back to their most productive use. Now, granted, the government can kick this down the road, as they have done. By creating more money, they can temporarily stop the bust from happening by utilizing policies and giving the money to certain actors who they ensure will hoard it as opposed to spend it, or invest in certain assets as opposed to different ones, they can prevent the hyperinflation from taking effect. But the bottom line is it cannot go on forever. And once you understand that there are a finite amount of goods and services, and that printing money does not create any new goods or services, you'll realize that it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And if anything, the fact that there hasn't been hyperinflation yet has only proven that the economists have done a very good job, economists, probably not the right word. The people at the Fed, the people dictating dictating monetary policy, government dictating fiscal policy, they've done a good job of kicking the can down the road. Perhaps you might even say they've done an exceptional job of kicking the can down the road, in that they've been able to do it this long. But what we're saying is it cannot go on forever. Sooner or later, it has to go bust.
I mean, anyone who understands what Austrian methodology is attempting to claim, attempting to prove and demonstrate, if you understand the basics of what the Austrian methodology is even claiming, you will understand why this is nothing more than just a dumb straw man argument. Because the entire point of the Austrian methodology is fundamentally just that there's no such thing as general economies. There are just people acting with other people to try and profit and make ends meet. And therefore, we can't study societies and market trends from a prescriptive perspective. We can only study them from a descriptive, like social approach, like the way that you would study social studies. Economics is not an empirical prescriptive science. It's a descriptive social study. So if you understand that, you'd understand that no one who is an Austrian would ever predict that at this time, at this day, this year, something will happen, because such an assumption would go completely against everything which the Austrian methodology is built upon assuming to be true.
So that is our response to Paul Krugman. I guess at this point, we've definitely hit that pretty hard. So.
Richard points out in the chat catalactics, and yeah, Mises used that term to describe it, because economics itself implies a general assumption of study from a prescriptive perspective to an entire sort of whatever arbitrarily generalized society. He used the term catalaxy, and that's about right. I don't know how much better I can put that.
All right, so moving on to, for other news this week. As previously mentioned, an additional 4.4 million Americans are out of work. We have talked on previous streams, though, about how that's not likely to change anytime soon, given that many of these Americans are discovering that unemployment actually pays more than if they were working. So they don't. Not only were a great deal of jobs destroyed, and that the underlying weaknesses of the economy were shown, for the time being, due to the CARES Act and these other government programs, people have been directly incentivized not to go back to work, even in light of many states reopening. And Filthy shared an article here from Market Watch for us to discuss that shows that millions of Americans are now not paying their mortgages. And it doesn't appear that that's going to change anytime soon. As anyone who studied the 2008 financial crisis knows, people defaulting on their mortgages is specifically what triggered the popping of the bubble that started the last recession. So I don't possibly see how this could possibly go wrong in any way, shape, or form.
This could only end well, you said with his fingers crossed.
Exactly. But yeah, looking at the specific article in question, over 4 million Americans are now skipping on their mortgage payments. That was published at MarketWatch on May 23rd, 2020. Which means, of course, the banks are not receiving when the banks don't receive the money for the mortgages they loaned out. They then don't have money to pay back to the Federal Reserve and others that they've loaned from. And as soon as people start defaulting, it's like a row of dominoes toppling over from one sector of the economy to another.
Wait, and can the government actually afford to bail out the banks this time like they did in 2008? Or like what?
Well, afford is a tricky word because, as men like Paul Krugman would say, the government can always afford to do anything because they can just, print. They can just print the money to bail them out.
Scarcity doesn't exist. Assets are just numbers on paper.
Exactly. So they can bail them out by printing more money, but it's remains to be seen how long they can keep doing this without completely causing the dollar to collapse. Right now, people have not ceased purchasing U.S. government debt yet. I know it's been a couple streams since we've talked about it. We talked about how the Bank of England effectively has had to monetize debt for the British government because there are not enough people or middlemen, effective banks and individuals. There are not effectively enough middlemen wanting to purchase debt from the UK government. The UK Treasury has had to start selling debt directly to the Bank of England, which effectively amounts to the Bank of England just printing money and loaning it to the UK government. That has not, to my knowledge, that has not yet started in the US, which means there are still enough people, there's still enough demand for US government debt that it doesn't have to, the Treasury doesn't have to sell directly to the Federal Reserve. But if the government bails out the banks or anyone else or prints too much money, sooner or later, investors are going to realize the dollar. We don't want any more dollars. There's too many of them. They're getting worthless. They're going to stop investing in U.S. government debt. At that point, the government will have to monetize the debt, sell debt directly to the Federal Reserve. And at that point, that really is, in my opinion, one of the major triggers that will show hyperinflation is right around the corner.
Yeah, good God, how long can the U.S. dollar and the British pound hold out against all this? This is so not going to end well. This is so not going to end well.
It'll probably take a few months before something happens to the pound, at which point our purchasing power as Americans for British goods is just going to absolutely skyrocket. And I would strongly recommend you look to buying British goods directly. And yeah, just be ready to own entire cities.
Well, that's the thing. The dominoes have already started falling, as I've pointed out several times. The only reason that the euro, the British pound, the US dollar, any of these fiat currencies even exist is because they're pyramided off of several assets on the global market through through the enforcement of trade cartels like OPEC or the IMF. And they're sort of integrated together. Like one central bank will be used to finance the loans of another currency, and that currency will be used to finance another one, vice versa. And all it takes is for the central banks to start defaulting for the system to slowly fall apart. It's kind of like reverse decentralization.
And think about perhaps an example that'll help people understand. Think about credit card fraud. So I am effectively broke. I have no money or assets, but I want to create the illusion that I'm rich. So I go and I get a bunch of credit cards. I go out and I start buying a bunch of stuff with my credit card. Of course, credit is merely a promise to pay in the future. The bank is fronting the money, and by buying with my credit card, I'm promising I'm going to pay them back with interest in the future. But when the time comes that the bill is due on that credit card, I then pay it off with another credit card. So I've now, I'm promising to pay off debt that I've already promised to pay off just using a different credit card. And when the time comes due for me to pay off that credit card, I pay it off with another credit card. And you might think that I can do this forever, but sooner or later, people are going to start suspecting, I don't think he really has the assets to cover all these promises he's made. He's paying off a promise to pay with another promise to pay.
And
And
the first credit card starts being used to finance the debt on credit cards used to finance that credit card. That's essentially a good way to sum up what the global financial system is in a nutshell.
mhm.
And all it takes is for the banks, which start creating those credit cards, to default. And there you go.
Mhm.
That's
What triggers the failing is that everyone's buying is not with real resources, but with a promise to pay. So someone at the end of the chain is counting on real resources being available with the income they've received. But since there's the government, the banks themselves don't actually have any real resources, and they're paying with promises to pay, sooner or later somebody comes up short. The what you were hoping to buy isn't there, and the system comes to a halt.
Yeah.
When people realize the goods and services, the resources they wanted aren't actually there, and this has all been a scam, that's when the whole thing inevitably collapses.
People begin to realize that these market signals, which they're allocating their resources around, i.e., in this case, the debts which are being paid for with these credit cards, and the returns that people who accept this person's payments are expecting, aren't actually there or aren't actually going to come. And but just what I was going to say is the dominoes have already started falling. Lebanon central bank defaulted. Argentina's central bank defaulted. Italy's central bank's about to default. Greece's central bank defaulted. Japan's national economy is in a recession right now. So, and this has all transpired over the course of the last month or so. The first one that defaulted was Lebanon, and I think Iran's central bank defaulted not too long ago.
Yeah, we talked about that. I think it was last week's stream.
And the fact of the matter is, there's countries which are starting to get farther up the pyramid in terms of influence, like Japan, for example, that are beginning to get there. So it's only a matter of time, basically, before it starts affecting the European Union or the United States.
Yeah.
And considering that a lot of the nations in the European Union, like Denmark and Germany, already are operating around negative interest rates, it's probably going to be pretty soon. Let's be honest.
Albedo says, don't forget Ecuador, Zambia, South Africa, and Mozambique.
Well, there you go.
And of course, there's going to be more as time goes on, and this whole thing is just going to end up with a whole lot of banks that are going to have to write off a whole lot of assets as losses, which of course is just going to cause the domino effect that we described earlier. You're going to see more third world countries going on, and then you're going to see a whole lot of first world countries that start to hold on to that debt. They're going to start to go down as well. I wouldn't be surprised if Germany, because they basically hold the European Union together by being not only the largest payer into that system, but also the holder of a large amount of debt, not only just in the European bloc, but also in the third world, that they're going to start seeing some very significant troubles. I mean, we already know that Deutsche Bank, even before this whole thing started to unravel, was losing like $1 million a day, I think.
And laid off like 50,000 employees over the span of 2019.
It's
ironic, considering the Germans should be better placed than anyone to understand the effects of hyperinflation, given that's what gave rise to the Third Reich.
Well, I mean, right now they're building the Fourth Reich, so that money needs to be built somewhere, or it needs to be gone from somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
However, right now it's like the thing that defeated Nazi Germany in World War II and defeated the Third Reich is also what's going to defeat the Fourth Reich. The freaking instability of their financial system and their economy.
Well, and the thing is, I've seen a lot of things that are getting put out by state media. Something else that you'll notice is they're starting to like move away from the approach as well that inflation is something undesirable. Like they're starting to normalize the idea of inflation. Like you're starting to see a lot of articles in CNN, for instance. I saw one the other day, trying to say that inflation is a good thing for the economy.
Yeah, and the opposite
The
too.
Fed,
That
and the Fed,
deflation is bad.
yeah, and the Fed chairman, not too long ago, said that the Fed can just infinitely print money, and that inflation is actually good. So I mean, I just it seems pretty clearly like that's just broadcasting what's in the near future.
Well, it's like it's denial of history and it's denial of basic economics. It's like you're literally denying everything that that free market economics and basically economics itself stands on. When they say that, so I mean, they're obviously trying to calm the people down. They're obviously trying to put faith, bring back the faith of the people, but it's going to blow up in their faces. There's no doubt about that.
What I can't fathom is how people could successfully be convinced that prices going down is bad. It is a bad thing if consumer prices go down. That's not going to help people get wealthier.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you have a credibility problem. Not in the sense that people lose credibility, but rather have more credibility than they otherwise should have. They don't know how things like inflation and deflation work. All they hear is just like inflation bad or deflation bad, and that's as far as their understanding of economics go. If they understood that deflation meant lower prices and increasing purchasing power, they would realize like, oh, hold on a second, this is fantastic. But no, they're trying to reverse the narrative by trying to get people afraid of deflation, while at the same time trying to push a narrative of, I believe the term that they're going to start using is responsible inflation.
I've already seen that starting to pop up, so I'm pretty sure you're right.
I think you shared the story with me, and I was like, oh crap, that's what they're going to be doing, like right away.
Right.
But just what I want to remind everybody of is that there's a difference entirely between the gray market and the white market. Like those are conflated, but assets in the gray market aren't included in GDP, for instance, and by most measures, gray market assets aren't accounted for. So obviously, there's a difference between these two areas of society. And the gray market right now is, largely unaffected by what's happening in the legal market. And the gray market infrastructure is actually expanding as a direct consequence of the legal economy collapsing. But also the gray market is what, obviously we're going to use to defeat the state. So for those of you who are wondering why I'm not, my view of the world is not, is not gloomy. I don't like what the state's doing, but I realize that what we're watching right now is not actually the triumphant rise of a police state, but rather the state's death grovels. Like, they're not going to continue sustaining themselves like this for much longer. And what we're seeing right now is nation states essentially on their deathbed. So I'm pretty happy, actually, to be perfectly honest. My profile picture is a pretty accurate summation of how I feel about the whole thing.
And I've kind of had the same attitude. I mean, I'm seeing a whole lot of people who are just like trying to accuse anarchists of being crazy, that the state is becoming more powerful, that there's a lot of people who are perfectly comfortable under these, let's be honest, this is completely tyrannical. These tyrannical dictates, these imperial decrees that have severely increased the victimization that the state has inflicted upon us. And they're seeing that just sort of like proof that our ideas don't work, that we're wrong about everything, and that the state is only increasing in power. But the thing is, though, like, as you pointed out, this isn't happening in a vacuum. This is exactly what you would expect a dying state to be doing. And we know it's dying. You can see the numbers before your eyes, and they only lead to one mathematical conclusion. There's no avoiding this. This shouldn't even be controversial. And the fact of the matter is, like any organized monopoly on violence throughout history, even non-states, like mafias do this. When they start to feel the noose tighten around their neck, they'll kick at anything, which means they'll become more violent. They'll become more oppressive. They'll do more ruthless and more dangerous things. Hell, you can even see companies do this. Like, I remember seeing people having discussions about what it was like in the last days of businesses, both small and large. And basically what happened is that, like, certain aspects, certain freedoms that you would be allowed in your white market job would go away, that bonuses would be rescinded, that you had to check, that bosses were a lot more clinical and critical about you showing up on time and then leaving on time, that they were just absolutely obsessed with you not getting any overtime, and that like certain things like, I don't know, cookies in the break room started disappearing, and you would see stuff like that. And this is exactly what you would expect a state in its last days to behave. So yeah, I have reasons to be optimistic as well.
Yeah, it's crazy that what I like to call them is cult of the omnipotent state libertarians. I haven't really thought of a better term, but that's a good way to describe the people that you're talking about, because because I've seen the people you're describing there. They ascribe like the imperial mandates issued by the state that you're talking about. They conflate legislative decrees with the state's actual ability to function, and as the end result is they end up like treating the state the exact same way that statists arguing positively for the state do. Like, I'm not saying these people are statists, but they end up developing a very similar mentality to statists who treat the state like it has supernatural powers and can do anything, because they conflate the state's ability to act with its decrees. But that's just it. This isn't a refutation of things that the Austrians and the Agorists specifically have been saying. This is a systematic confirmation of what we've been saying for years. You're seeing states becoming increasingly violent in what they're threatening people with, but with less of an ability to actually act because they're so strained for resources. Meanwhile, people aren't flocking back to the white market because the white market's becoming increasingly unprofitable. They're going to the gray and black market, and they're creating an infrastructure around the gray and black market, around self-employment. Because what we knew even before the Depression started was that self-employment was already more profitable in local economies, I mean.
All right, we are starting to approach the top of the hour here. So for those in the chat, if you have any closing questions, issues you'd like us to address, please put them in the comment section now. I see Lights473 is mentioning that more and more people are talking about modern monetary theory. I've definitely seen that to be the case. I'm considering making a comprehensive video about modern monetary theory sometime in the near future. So.
Yeah, it's
if I could help some way, I'd love to. But I don't see modern monetary theory becoming prominent outside of academia or the state media. I think that's just an instance of the state becoming the ideas that it tries to promote becoming increasingly disassociated from reality as the state becomes more desperate to sustain itself.
All right, Albedo says, talk about New York City bankruptcy. I think we did mention that. It might have been last week or the week before. But yeah, the whole state of New York is bankrupt, to my understanding, and Andrew Cuomo wants the federal government to bail him out. It actually led to an article in the Wall Street Journal called "Should Florida Bail Out New York?" And the argument was like Ron DeSantis, the governor in Florida, says, I managed my crisis well. He managed his crisis poorly. New York's been making poor financial decisions for a long time. Why should citizens of my state bail out the citizens of the government's poor choices in New York? And I think there's a legitimate point to be made there about how anytime the federal government bails someone out, they do so either by taxing the citizens or by increasing the money supply to bail those people out. And in both cases, people who actually saved, either people who are actually productive and created value are taxed and have the fruits of their labor taken away, or people who worked hard, saved the value they earned, see their savings deplete because the government created more money. So yes, you are effectively penalizing the people who have created the most value in order to bail out the people who have created the least amount of value, and it's utterly ridiculous.
Thoughts on? Oh my! Do you see Fusion's comments there? Oh my God, that was. Thoughts on Biden's comment on black voters?
Oh dear.
I seriously don't like. I'm so disconnected from the electoral cycle at this point. I don't care even a little bit. But I saw that not too long ago. Like one of my family members showed me, and I was rolling. For those of you who didn't hear about it, because you're probably in a similar mindset to me when it comes to the election. Biden was on like a podcast recently.
The Breakfast Club or whatever it's called.
The Breakfast. I don't know what show it was. The Breakfast Club. And what he said to the audience before he left the call was that if you don't, like a lot of people say what he said was, if you vote for Donald Trump, you're not a black person. But what he actually said was a lot worse. What he said is, if you're undecided about whether or not you're going to vote for me or Trump, you're not a black person, or you ain't black, as he put it.
It's beautiful.
That is so cringy.
Honestly, I think the Democratic Party is going to do everything they can to prevent an actual debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. But I want so badly to watch Donald Trump and Joe Biden debate.
Yeah.
Now, granted, I don't like Trump. He's done a lot of stupid things, but the man's at least entertaining. And Biden is, of course, as someone said, suffering from Alzheimer's probably. To watch Donald Trump absolutely humiliate Joe Biden in a debate would be glorious to behold.
Here's the thing. Here's the thing that most people don't realize, though. I've seen Joe Biden debate. It is very unpleasant. The guy is an absolute asshole in debates.
Joe Biden, I don't even really care about like race concerns usually, but even for me, it's really, really cringy to hear a white guy in his late 70s try and denounce an entire subgroup of black people.
And if I'm not mistaken,
trying to act as a gatekeeper for who is or isn't black. That's something about that just like sends a shudder up my spine.
The NCAAP or whatever it's called, I'm pretty sure I saw something today. They were not particularly happy with that statement.
It's don't worry, they'll forgive him though. I mean, let's not forget that Lyndon Johnson said that he's going to get the N-words to vote Democrat for the next 200 years. And so far, it's only been like, 70, 80? So we still have another 120 years to go before that stops. Although not like it matters. I mean, the reason that me and Esso are presumably others are so disconnected from the voting process is because we both recognize that who gets in doesn't really matter, as they'll both basically do the same thing. Yeah, sure, there'll be some differences here, and you're going to see some liberals/conservatives screeching about it on the streets of towns across America every now and then. But ultimately, in terms of actual results, nothing really changes in terms of our victimization. We're basically arguing, do you want to be taxed at 20% of your income or 19% of your income?
Yeah, I have an article on my blog, which I subsequently made into a video, basically showing how, regardless of who occupies the White House, regardless who controls Congress, two things occur every presidential cycle: the government taxes and go up, spending increases, and the government grows in the size and scope of its authority. So,
Well, I mean, the fact that the results are going to be predictable aside, the other reason I don't care is I don't find it to be interesting because I've realized that just working in the gray market has allowed me to free myself more than the political process ever can or ever will. And that's sort of the
JC
approach.
Armitage, I just wanted to say this to JC Armitage's comment. Yeah, you can't vote your way out of $25 trillion or $25 trillion debt. By the election, it's probably going to be $30 trillion.
Not unlikely. I mean, if the government continues on the trajectory that it's on, there are those that have proposed by the end of 2020 we could be at 40 or 50 trillion. I mean, the sky's the limit at this point. Krugman and others have said so.
Well, I mean, don't forget that printing money doesn't actually result in an increase in money. That's what Krugman taught us. Oh, and by the way, I know we have to say this like every time, but it's kind of obligatory at this point. But yes, Paul Krugman is the guy who overtly recommended inflating a housing bubble to get us out of the dot-com bubble. And he also overtly recommended the government faking an alien invasion to stimulate the economy after the 2008 financial crisis.
He also claimed that the Holocaust ended the Great Depression.
Oh, God.
So this guy's an infinite hot take generator in terms of economics.
Oh, you're not
Yeah.
just getting outside of economics. Remember his QAnon tweet that he made back in January?
I don't. Refresh my memory.
The one where he claimed that, God, I don't even, what was it that he said? Like he called the police because somebody put child porn on his computer.
Oh, right. Oh my goodness. How could I forget about that?
Well, these days, Paul Krugman seems to get most of his attention from the New York Times, and clearly there's a reason for that. So, on that note, thank you everybody for checking out this stream. We will be back next week to talk about all the insanity that is COVID-19. Thanks everybody for continued watching and support. Live free, be strong, and as always, that is my 2 cents. So, take it for what it's worth.